It's called crushed crab. I was riding my bike as fast as I could. I was late for dinner again. I was chronically late for dinner, and it drove my parents crazy. I came around the curve of the creek where my parents lived. My knees were pumping up and down, up and down, up and down, and my white Keds on those black pedals were going so fast they were kind of a gray blur. I had my sights fixed on a point about a third of the way up our driveway, which was about a quarter-mile long and about a 45-degree angle. I never made it all the way up. It was my sincerest and fondest hope that someday I would. And so what I would do was ride as fast as I could and look at the point and try and make it to the point. And I was so concentrating on catching up and being on time and making it up the hill that I sort of felt and heard the squish and crunch before I saw it, and when I looked down, I stood on my brakes really hard and then put my brand new white Keds right down into the middle of a crushed and very wet horseshoe crab. They were everywhere, all around me. I couldn't figure out why. All the way from before my parents' driveway to Cat Hollow Road, which is the next road over, the road was littered with dead and dying horseshoe crabs. I love horseshoe crabs. The very first one I ever collected, I was no more than 5. I found a little tiny carapace, no bigger than my dad's thumbnail, and I dried it, and it had been on the mantle ever since. And now my collection at the time of this story went from little tiny all the way up to dinner plate size, and there was no reason for them to be on the road. Every once in a while, my parents lived at the beach. One or two would get confused after mating, and they'd climb across this narrow beach and end up on the road, but everybody in town would scoop them up and take them back to the water and slip them in where they belonged. And I thought, well, maybe it was a full moon or a high tide or hundreds and hundreds of them, and I was so sad. I started to cry. I forgot about dinner. I forgot about the driveway. Instead, I put down my kickstand, and very gently and carefully as I could, I picked up each one, and I piled them in the basket of the bicycle, and I wheeled it across the parking lot to the great big 55-gallon drum at the end of the town pier. And I put them in carefully on top of the newspapers, all littered with fish scales and fish heads. And 3 or 4 trips it took to clear up as many as I could, and I was covered in crushed crab guts and sobbing, and by the time I wheeled my bike up, I'd long missed dinner. And I explained to my father what had happened, and nobody was mad. My mother washed out my clothes, and no one could figure it out either. We thought it was just some weird anomaly. By the next morning, I put on my slightly damp favorite shorts that I wore all the time and my shirt, and I took my bike back down to the bottom of our driveway. It was way more fun going down at the end, and as I scooted to the end and went to turn right, I could hear them. Not the crabs again, something else, a sound that was unmistakable, the hooting and hollering of boys. I was just 13. Boys were not high on my list of things I wanted to hear hooting and hollering. And I thought I could see at the end of the parking lot 3 of them doing something I thought I could figure out. So I wheeled across the little tiny pebbles and went around the side of the lifeguard shack and made it halfway across the parking lot, and I could see them. It was George and Billy and one of their friends, the neighborhood bullies. George had a big horseshoe crab in his hand. He had it over his head, and he smashed it down on the ground, and they whoa at the top of their lungs, and I was pissed. 2 more times before I could even make my feet move. I started to ride towards them, and I screamed, "Cut that out! Put that down now! You can't do that!" in a way that only a skinny little red hair, freckled, kind of all knees and elbows girl can do. They looked at me. "Put it down," said George. "I'll put it down." He picked up a really big one and smashed it on the ground twice. I was furious. "Don't you dare!" I rode as hard as I could. I rode right up to George, and then I rode right up him. right up his naked leg to the edge of his shorts. I pushed him down on the ground, and then I jumped off my bike and onto him. And I punched him as hard as my cousins had taught me how to without putting my thumbs inside so they wouldn't break. And I whomped him, and I whomped him, and I whomped him. And all of a sudden I realized what I was doing, which was not something my mother would have approved of. I didn't think, although on balance, crabs, George. But I hopped off, and I was not going to cry in front of those boys, even though what I wanted to do more than anything right then was cry. My hands hurt, my heart hurt. I didn't know what to do, and my father was nowhere around. And I realized that they were much bigger than me, way much bigger than me. However, something about how I looked and how I wiped underneath my nose and how I wiped the blood and the snot on my shorts made them wonder just what it was about me that was so scary. They backed up, turned around and ran, grabbed their bikes, and took off. Once again, I gathered up all of those crab bodies, and I piled them all in the 55-gallon drum, which at this point was pretty much full. And I wheeled my way back up to my parents' house before lunch. It was a Saturday. My father was home. So I explained what happened, and while I sobbed in his arms, he explained to me that there were people that were mean, that I had done the right thing, that even though I had hit George as hard as I could and made him bleed, and even though I had left tire tracks on his leg, which is not something he would ordinarily have approved of, in this case, there was an argument to be made for my behavior. George and I did eventually get to be friends, about 2 years later. He never apologized for what he did, but as far as I know, he never killed another crab.